Okay, hello everyone. I'm Mr. Sherman Lee. Today I'll be going through with all of you the 2020 question 2 CSQ and more specifically the higher order thinking questions. So during your MYAs, I think a lot of us struggled with being able to think about what the questions required, and because of that, we weren't able to exactly solve the questions or write what we needed to write to score the L3 marks and the evaluation marks. So today, I will bring all of us through question analysis and reading the CSQs so that we will be able to know how to dissect the questions and find out what questions want from us right when we see it. Okay, so I'll give you a bit of time to take out your CSQ. I won't be going through the in-depth answers of each of the higher order thinking questions. The focus of the lesson today, rather, is to help everyone have an understanding of how we should dissect and answer different types of questions so that during the exam, your A levels, or even during your revision, you are able to uh, easily and more masterfully deal with your CSQ questions. So let's look at the CSQ first. Before I even read the extracts, right, I will look at what my questions require from me. So today I'll be going through these three questions: D part 1, part 2, and E. Okay, so because in your new syllabus you don't have any more double-barreled questions such as explain and comment, and you don't have a 7-mark question anymore, we will change it to answer this 6-mark question instead. Discuss whether the deflationary policies were beneficial to the economies. So before we delve into the different extracts, let's look at what each of the questions require. So you see here, extract 6 relates to the policy of austerity adopted, not always willingly, by some governments after the 2008 global financial crisis. So here, very importantly, we must know what austerity measures are. So austerity measures are measures that are very drastic, severe measures to help to mitigate the impacts of an economic crisis. Usually, economic crisis impacts, and usually it is done to avoid a debt crisis from the government. So if you want to avoid debt crisis, right, if you think about it, it's likely to deal with a maybe increase in taxes or a decrease in G. And then we look at the context they give us, 2008 global financial crisis. So even before reading the extracts to this case study, we have a rough idea of what the case study will tell us about. So when we look at D part 1, discuss whether the deflationary policies were beneficial to the economies. First, when we do such higher order thinking questions, we must always think from the perspective of the examiner. What do they require? We know that our content marks, our L marks, will be worth 4 marks in this 6-mark question, and our evaluation marks will likely be worth 2 marks. So this will give you a rough gauge of how much you need to write for each portion. And when I say whether the deflationary policies were beneficial, I know straight away, right, I will definitely need to have a thesis and antithesis approach to this question. With the thesis being beneficial and antithesis being not beneficial or even harmful. So I'll write it down first. So after we break down this question, right, we know straight away, it makes it a lot easier because we know straight away what we are looking for when we're reading through the CSQs. So we move on to the next question. For this 8-mark question, we break it down first. Content marks will account for 6 marks. Evaluation marks will account for 2 marks. And let's look at this. Assess the suggestion that with low interest rates, governments should have borrowed to invest instead of adopting the austerity policies. So what they're trying to tell you here, this in itself is a comparative question. When I say comparative, they're telling me that I should have done this instead of this. And what condition did they give us? Given that there were low interest rates, the government should have chose to invest instead of adopt the austerity policies. So similarly, for part 2, we will know that we will have a thesis antithesis approach as well. And with this thesis antithesis approach, we will know that one, governments should have borrowed to invest instead of adopting, and the second one can be governments should not have borrowed to invest instead of adopting, or even governments should have adopted the austerity policies despite the low interest rate. So you see, right, when they give you this very unique condition over here, low interest rate, we must be very wary. We have to tackle this condition throughout our essay. If we just answer governments should borrow to invest instead of adopting austerity, you don't deal with the question in its entirety. Now we move on to the last question first. We have discussed the view that countries require more inclusive growth. So by itself, this question would seem very vague. So what does it mean? Because the previous questions, they gave us the context of austerity, they gave us the context of the 2008 global financial crisis. So at first glance, it might not be very clear what this question requires from us from the extract. So we will just dissect it as if it's a theoretical question first, and then we'll see in the extract if we can find any more interesting details. So when we see discuss the view, 10 marks, we know straight away 7 marks will go to our content and 3 marks will go to our evaluation. So when I discuss the view, I know that countries need more inclusive growth. Straight away, right? I know this. If I were to rephrase these questions, if I were to rephrase this question, do you see that I can also say, do you believe that countries need more inclusive growth? So straight away, I know this is also the thesis antithesis approach. I would just need one that says countries need more inclusive growth and countries do not need more inclusive growth. So now that we've roughly got an understanding of what we're looking for in the extracts, let's do the questions one by one. I'll start from part D, part 1 first. So I want to discuss whether or not the deflationary policies were beneficial to the economies that impacted, right? So let's look through the extracts. So if you've read the extracts, actually, a lot about this just tells you how the different countries recovered after the financial crisis. But something very interesting you can see here is that different countries had different experiences when it came to how they boosted or how they recovered their economies after the 2008 financial crisis. But this, you realize, is not exactly what we're looking for. So let's move down. This in the question, they specifically said extract 6. So let's look at extract 6. Okay. 8 years after special measures were imposed on Greece by the relevant international agencies, including the IMF, the country was deemed capable once more to stand on its own economic feet. However, the damage done had been huge. From peak to trough, GDP in Greece fell by almost 1/3, with corresponding consequences for employment and living standards as a result of having to follow the path of austerity. So you see our keyword comes up over here. The policy option was based on the belief that the correct response to the immediate danger caused by the global financial crisis was for governments to concentrate on reducing their net expenditure by adopting deflationary policies such as cuts in government spending and increases in taxation. So you realize, right, that Cambridge is actually very nice here because even if you didn't know what austerity was, they actually gave you very clear hints that austerity means that the government wants to concentrate on reducing their expenditure, maybe through a decrease in G or an increase in tax. So here we say that governments, of course, Greece is not alone, merely the hardest hit. So other countries were also impacted by such issues. So you see Ireland, Italy, and the UK have been others who suffered greatly through their austerity policies. And extensive and permanent damage has been done, especially in terms of social consequences. Such phenomena like closed library, unused care centers, and increased use of charitable food donations, there is opportunity cost in terms of infrastructure that could have been repaired or rebuilt had the government taken advantage of the ridiculously low interest rates. So you see another keyword here, but you wouldn't really want to deal with it right now because you realize this is for another question. So I'll leave it be and I'll focus on part D. So for part D, part one, when we want to explain the benefits, right, we would have to look at this. When I say whether or not it was beneficial for the economies, right? You realize the economies, when we're talking about the economy, we're always talking about the macro economy. So I would like to always try to deal with my macro goals, right? So I have my inclusive and sustainable growth. I have my favorable BOT. I have price stability. And I have low unemployment, right? So I'll give you 2 minutes, and then with this, maybe you try and think about what we require, or maybe 10 seconds. Okay, so now I'll go through beneficial versus not beneficial. So I'll always start with I don't really, it doesn't really matter what our stand is. No matter what, we always have to clear out thesis and antithesis. So economically speaking, right, what we know from the 2008 global financial crisis, we can infer that many of the governments were likely in debt. So they probably had high level, likely most of the governments had debt. And beyond that, consumer and investment outlook, consumer and investor outlook was likely bleak. So with these two things in mind, right, we can say that maybe these deflationary policies were beneficial to the economy because it allows government to reduce their debt accumulation. So it allows government to reduce debt, which helps to improve the budget position. And we know that when you improve the budget position and you reduce the debt that the government has, right, in the long run, it can actually help to boost a country's economy. So in the long run, can boost country's economy. Why? Because you realize as an investor or consumer, right, if my government in this country is one that owes a lot of money, I don't even know if they will stand the next day. I don't even know if they're going to collapse the next day. I won't have much consumer confidence or investor confidence. Am I right? So when we look at this, in the long run, when I manage to reduce my debt, you can see that this will help to, in the long run, it reduces my debt. So it will help to improve business and consumer confidence in the long run. Business confidence. And we know that when there's improved consumer confidence, business confidence, this will lead to a rise in C and a rise in I. And these together, as they are components of the AD, they will lead to actual economic growth, right? And when it comes to investment, another thing you can talk about is if they invest in capital goods, this could also lead to an increase in your long run AS, which would be reflected by a rightward shift of your vertical AS, which would mean that there's also potential economic growth. And together, these two will lead to sustained EG. So you see this point over here, right? I talked about I had to bring in some form of contextual knowledge that I had about what was how countries were like after the uh, 2008 global financial crisis, and then I linked how austerity measures or the deflationary policies were able to actually maybe benefit the economies who took part in them in the long run. Now, antithesis, I need to say that it's not beneficial or it's even harmful for the economies, right? So straight away, I need to think in terms of my macro goals, how could deflationary policies harm my economy? We need to realize that when we have deflationary policies, by nature, they are contractionary in nature. Am I right? So when we discuss contractionary policies, right, be it your contractionary fiscal policy, contractionary monetary policy, right, you realize that contractionary policies usually lead to a fall in AAD somehow. Am I right? And when I draw the ADAS diagram, when I draw ADS diagram, I have YF here, AS. When I have a fall in AD, let's say assuming there was no multiplier effect, I have a fall in AD. You see that not only does the real GDP of my country fall, right? So actually there's negative economic growth. There's also an increase in demand deficient unemployment. Initially, it was YF minus Y naught units. And now, because of the contractionary policies, it has become YF minus Y1 units. And you can see why this is a bigger output gap as compared to initially, right? So these are problems that can be caused to the economy. Why? Because in the short run, these deflationary policies are contractionary in nature, leads to a fall in AD, and then maybe you could have your reverse multiplier, your downward multiplier effect, and then the key is in the end point. This will lead to negative actual economic growth and increase in demand deficient unemployment. And so you see how we always link our economic issues back to a few of that macro goals. That way we know that we are always dealing with what the question wants. Beyond that, you realize when we look at extract 6, something very interesting, right? We saw that it also led to a lot of, social consequences. So maybe we want to tackle that. So beyond just the fact that it's deflationary, we can also discuss the fact that if if we perform such deflationary measures, right, when there's a fall, negative actual growth, real GDP falls, this could also worsen the standard of living for the people, right? So worsen the standard of living maybe in terms of material or non-material SOL. And beyond just this fall in AD, blah, 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 right? We know that the government's objective also is to reduce debt levels. But you realize that if there's a fall in AD and there's a fall in output from the economy, right? This would also lead to government being able to collect less taxes. Because if people are getting retrenched, people are losing their jobs, people are earning less income, they have less money to give the government in terms of taxes. And this may not even help the government's budget position in the short run, may not help government's budget strain. So here what we do is we really map out an idea of what we can, or rather what we can discuss or what we can talk about through our essay. So now for the 2-mark evaluation, right, you see it's actually quite clear cut over here. When we use our ATMS angle, we would likely look at the T portion, right, time period, because we discussed that in the long run, this would help to reduce debt, improve budget position, which would bolster consumer and business confidence. But then in the short run, it will lead to contractionary impacts in the economy. So we would definitely discuss this in terms of long run versus short run. We would say that in the short run, it would likely be harmful for the reasons we discussed. However, in the long run, such deflationary policies may benefit the economy even more. You realize, so we evaluate this, and then you could say whether or not the deflationary policies would help would depend largely on the type of country they are. Type of country, the initial state of the economy, and so on and so forth. So, of economy, the initial debt levels. So, anything that is relevant to the case studies and has something to do with the extract, we can discuss about it. Okay? And then now, now that we're done with question D part 1, right, let's look at question D part 2. Assess the suggestion that with the low interest rates, governments should have borrowed to invest instead of adopting austerity policies. So when I go here, I have no space down here, so I'll just do it here. When I look at the thesis would be should have borrowed, and the antithesis will be should not have, right? It's just a flip of what we wrote in the thesis. Should not have. So let's look back. We realized just now, right? We saw something about the low interest rates and the borrowing to invest. It was already mentioned in the extract. So I'll give you 10 seconds. Maybe you look through the extract again and you see if you can come up with any points for discussion. Okay, so the 10 seconds is about up. So now let's look at the question, okay? Why should they have borrowed? So before we even engage with this question, we need to think about some context. When okay, yes, there were low interest rates, but we also need to recognize that this was during the period of the economic crisis, right? Economic crisis means that the countries were likely not doing very well. They were having recession, they were having negative impacts on their economy. So they were in a process of trying to rebuild their economies. So this is some necessary context that we will have got from the different extracts in the case study, right? So let's look at this. With low interest rates, governments should have borrowed to invest because it could lead to a rise in actual economic growth. How do we link that? So straight away, right, we would say with the low interest rates, governments borrow to invest, and then when government invests, it actually leads to a rise in government expenditure, right? And this government expenditure, because government expenditure is a component of AD, we realize that this will lead to a multiplied rise in AD, assuming spare capacity, right? But because it is right after the economic crisis, most countries were probably at more than they probably had excess spare capacity anyways. So we can bring in that to show that you're dealing with the context. And this increase in G will lead to a multiplied rise in AD, leading to actual economic growth. And also, I mean, if you want to, you can also say a fall in, which also would be reflected by a fall in demand deficient unemployment. Okay, so far? So then you will just draw the diagram. So the diagram, something like this. I never label, but you all need to label. And then the idea is there is a multiplied rise in AD and a multiplied increase in our real GDP. Okay, so this is your ADAS diagram. And then now it comes to a little bit of evaluation. Not only does it lead to actual growth, does it lead to fall in demand, deficient unemployment, you realize that the proviso here is that there are low interest rates. So when I want to evaluate these low interest rates, right, I can say that considering its low interest rates, it would mean that after the government borrows to invest, they need to pay back less than they would have in the interest rate if the interest rates had been higher, less in the future, right? And we just now discussed in part one that debt levels are a concern. The government budget position, how much debt the government is in, is one of the concerns of the government. So if I pay back less, it could actually prevent debt levels from rising too high. Debt levels from rising too high. And this in itself would be a good justification of why the government should have borrowed. Can you see that? Because not only can they improve their economy, they can also make sure that their debt levels don't skyrocket while in the process of bringing their economy out of recession. However, when should a government not engage in investment to borrowing to invest even when there are low interest rates? Let's think about it logically, okay? No matter how high or low the interest rates are, if you are already very, very much in debt, it doesn't make sense for you to uh, invest, correct? Because let's say if I have if I'm $5,000 in debt now, even if the bank tells me that tomorrow there's 0% interest rates, I still won't borrow to invest because to begin with, my initial debt levels are already very high. So my antithesis is countries which have pre-existing high debt levels with pre-existing high debt levels should definitely not borrow to invest. Instead, they should probably adopt the austerity policies. So why do I say that? If you think about it, when I talk about my austerity policies, I'm talking about cutting back expenditure, government expenditure, and increasing my tax revenue. So both of which, right, will help to improve my government budget position and reduce my debt. So you see, right, even though my country is in recession, even though there are low interest rates, I need to prioritize. I need to say, hey, even though the interest rates right now are very low, I would still likely have to focus on being able to improve my government budget position. I need to reduce my debt levels before I even think about borrowing to investing for the very simple reason, in the long run, even if I manage to invest a lot and a lot by borrowing, right? In the long run, two things will happen. One, my debt levels will be very, very high. And then two, I will have very little to no consumer or business confidence precisely because my debt level is very, very high. So it doesn't make sense, right? I borrow to invest to increase AD, but because my debt levels become so high, consumers and businesses lose confidence and then they invest less or they buy less and then my AD falls again. So in the long run, these two effects kind of negate each other. So as a government, if my debt levels are already very high, I will want to deal with this first. Okay? So I will explain this idea of for countries with high debt levels, I would deal with my pre-existing high debt levels first before even exploring to invest. Therefore, even with the low interest rates, I would not borrow to invest if I already had a lot of debt. Okay, and then now when it comes to the final evaluative conclusion, your synthesis, you realize that this is 3 marks, right? So what you have to do is you need to pick one of the angles, A, T, and S, right? And then you would just explain it. So most importantly, we realize here, right, countries with pre-existing high debt levels should not. Countries should because it can lead to actual economic growth. So the whether or not a country should borrow to invest largely depends on their initial country debt level. Am I right? Can you see that? Initial debt level. So after I discuss this initial debt level, I would say why? Because countries with high debt will probably blah blah blah. Countries with low debt levels can take advantage of the low interest rates to not only boost their economy but rescue their economy from the impacts of the recession. So you see, I not only argue in terms of the economic theory, I engage the case extract by talking about the idea, what would it probably, the financial crisis will probably be leaving the countries in blah 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 state, and then I link it to my evaluative conclusions so that I show the examiner that I'm actively engaging with the case material. Now, for the last question, it is more theoretical in nature, right? But we realize that, oh, sorry, the evaluation here for part 2 is still 2 marks. It's not 3 marks. Okay, this is 2 marks. 2 marks. So no need to write too much. You think about it, 6 marks, 2 marks, you should write 3 times longer or even more for the L part than the evaluation part. So let's break down this question. Discuss the view that countries need more inclusive growth. So the thesis, antithesis, the thesis is very, very clear, right? From the get-go, we know the thesis is need. The antithesis is don't need. So when I break down my question like that, right, it's a lot easier for me to find points. So when I see I need, right, then where would I look for my ideas? So let's look back at this case study, okay? Can you see over here? They say what? Most of the income growth was experienced by high earners and income inequality worsened as a result. Or even in extract 7, we see that there has always been technological disruption, job replacement, resulting in growing income inequalities. And so workers with greater skills, but then would stay ahead, while workers who don't have the skills, who cannot keep up, will be displaced and they will suffer. So from this, right, we can get the idea that generally that there is an increase. So let's set the context. Generally, right, income inequality is worsening. And why is it worsening? Because of technological disruptions, maybe even because of the financial crisis. And the lower wage workers, they are likely to be less skilled, so they are more substitutable, they are easier to retrench, they are less necessary for firms to operate. Am I right? So the financial crisis. So we need to keep thinking in terms of this, the lens of the case study that they have given us. So countries need more inclusive growth because, or rather, countries need more inclusive growth when income inequality is high. Why? Because I want to avoid the adverse effects. Okay, I'll spell it out. Adverse effects of income inequality, right? So very, very intuitively, this is when I will want to have more inclusive growth. But you realize, right? Okay, even before I talk about this thesis and antithesis, I go in. Okay, let's look at the antithesis first. They may not require inclusive growth if they have other priorities first. So you think about it very intuitively. If I don't even have actual growth, my economy is struggling. I have very high inflation, very high deflation. I have a large BOT surplus, a large BOT deficit, or whatever economic mess you can think of, right? Inclusive growth would not be my priority as of right now. Also, if I already have a significant level of inclusion in my society, I may not need or I may not want to have more inclusive growth at this time because due to my other priorities, we need to realize that inclusive growth can also compromise other economic goals. Okay, so this is what I need y'all to realize first. And then we look at this question. When we talk about inclusive growth, you realize this is a technical term. So as best as possible, right, if we have a technical term, we must always define. So the definition of inclusive growth, you all should be very familiar with it by now. It is growth that is sustained, broad-based across economic sectors, provides productive employment and opportunities for most of the working population, and inclusive growth likely is one that takes income distribution into account and doesn't worsen existing income inequalities in the country. So I look at this thesis, right? When I go through this question with this thesis, maybe I give you all about 5 to 7 seconds. Y'all think how y'all can carry the argument down. Okay, so I'll go through the thesis first. So first of all, what are the adverse effects of income inequality? Before that, let's look at the case material, right? We highlighted that most of the increase in income are earned by high earners. So this is in extract 4, and then we know in extract 7 states that inequality in income has increased in the past 25 years, or even the part where unfortunate workers are getting displaced because of technological disruptions. So this is extract 4, extract 7, extract 7. Okay, so when I look at this, right, straight away, when I know that this is proof that income inequality is high or income inequality is increasing. So why does that lead to adverse effects on the economy? First of all, we realize that when you have high income inequality, that it's actually an effect of something, right? It's likely that the low skilled workers are either being replaced by your capital, like robots, AI, either they are being replaced, they are being retrenched, and they don't have sufficient skills to move into a growing industry, so they are not able to cope with the increase or the technological change as much, right? So this would likely mean that there's an increase in structural unemployment, right? Second of all, when I have very high income inequality, you realize that this is actually exacerbated when there is technological change. So this technological change, which worsens structural unemployment, also worsens our income inequality. And when there's increase in unemployment, you realize that the workers who are retrenched or replaced, they suffer a lower standard of living. So this should be more than enough for the governments to want to require more inclusive growth. Am I right? But when I say standard of living, right, I need to be able to kind of define it or explain. So why? When I'm unemployed, maybe I have no job, I have no house, no income, it will increase things like homelessness, it will increase crime, and this would probably lead to a worsening of my non-material standard of living. So I would probably have to do, the government would probably have to uh, fight for more inclusive growth in countries where income inequality is high or where income inequality is worsening because they need to avoid or deal with the effects as a result of a high income inequality. And by dealing with it, we will naturally achieve more inclusive growth. Another, for the antithesis, you realize that maybe I have other priorities or it will compromise other economic goals. So just now we said, right, if let's say I'm a country that suffering a whole load of problems. I have lack of economic growth, I have a lot of unemployment, my prices are not stable, balance of trade is horrible. You realize that I have bigger issues to focus on, right? So even like countries, if we infer from the case extract, let's say countries like Greece and Italy, after the, oh, I spell wrong, and Italy, after the global financial crisis, right? They wouldn't likely prioritize inclusive growth because they have what? They have very high debt levels, right? And to focus on inclusive growth, we need budget, we need money to reskill people, to give people a competitive edge, to let people upskill themselves to the level of the other people as well. We need money, right? But if we have very high debt levels, we cannot afford to fork out such money to begin with. So what these countries will do, maybe because of the recession, so due to recession, they may have other priorities like focus on actual economic growth first, or even focus on sustain, which is your actual and economic growth, actual and potential. So they need to focus on the basics first before they can even start to consider the different kinds of the nuanced part of it, like whether or not the growth they're having is inclusive, whether or not it's sustainable. Before they can think about whether or not it's inclusive or sustainable, they need to have growth first. So they'll focus on growth first. Beyond that, you need to realize that when we strive for economic growth, sorry, not economic growth, when we strive for inclusive growth, it can actually compromise or interfere with our other economic goals, right? So why? If let's say I try to improve income inequality, right? Maybe by increasing taxes for the rich people, the progressive taxes, I increase it for the rich people so that rich people have to pay more, less rich people have to pay less, right? What would this do? If you are a billionaire and my taxes increase to like 90%, obviously I'm going to leave the country, right? Why would I stay in a country where my taxes are 90% when I can leave to go to a country where maybe my taxes are only 20, 30%? So this will lead to what? This will lead to them leaving the country, am I right? So when it leads to leaving the country, right, all the top income earners, they might move away from the country. And this will lead to a fall in productive capacity. It could also lead to let's say if they own very, very big firms, they bring their whole firms out. This could also worsen unemployment. So you see, sometimes in the strive for such economic growth like inclusive growth, right? So actually the list can go on. So the full answers, they will still be in your ERP. But the idea is we want to take you through the thought process of how we derive at our answers. So you realize that if you can worsen unemployment, it can lead to a fall in productive capacity. It can even lead to a fall in actual growth because maybe they don't want to come here anymore. Nobody's interested in coming here because of such high taxes, right? These will all lead to the compromising of other economic goals. So the question is it worth it? And that is what we need to evaluate. We need to evaluate the idea, right? Whether or not all countries need more inclusive growth. First, we need to identify one thing. It is that inclusive growth by itself, right, is a macro goal. So in the long run, we need to recognize this. In the long run, all countries will likely strive for it anyways. Would have to strive for it. Will have to strive for it eventually. However, as we are speaking right now, right, um, whether or not a country needs more inclusive growth largely depends on the state of their economy. Why? Because we need to realize that uh, when we seek for inclusive growth, right, it can actually hinder us with some of our other economic goals. So the state of the economy is very important in whether or not discussing countries need more inclusive growth now. So what we would likely conclude is although countries would eventually have to strive for inclusive growth because it is one of our macro goals of the government, it largely, whether or not we need it right now, it really depends on how a country's economy is doing. And if they are not doing well, if they have other priorities, they will have to focus on that first because the pursuit for inclusive growth comes at the expense of other goals. For the very simple reason, you cannot have everything in the world at once. You have to sacrifice something. So it really depends on what a country's priority is at the point in time. But obviously, we will also concede that at the end of the day, all countries will need to pursue inclusive growth eventually. So this is a rough breakdown of how I would or how we would think through such high order thinking questions. Maybe you can go back and look through the answers and see this help. If not, this will be all for the 2020 question 2, and I'll see you in the other lectures. Bye bye.